Okay, grade 12s, here we are picking up with the last stages of baby development. And that means we need to deal with childbirth, lactation, a couple of technologies. So vocabulary-wise, you should know the term parturition. Parturition is the more technical term for childbirth. Just think about it, parting. So when the baby parts from the mother, we're in parturition. What's happening? The placenta, that major hormonal gland of pregnancy, near the end of its term, it produces and releases the hormone relaxin. Relaxin is going to act to loosen ligaments in the pelvis, the softening of the cervix. Remember, that's that plug that's been has allowed the baby to develop in the uterus. And we're going to get ready for the baby to pass its way through the birth canal. Now, at this stage, progesterone levels will fall, of course, because it's the pregnancy hormone. Pregnancy is at an end, so progesterone levels are going to drop. Okay? And that's going to allow the contractions of the uterus to begin, because remember, that was one of progesterone's functions, not only to build and maintain the endometrium, but then not to allow contractions of that muscular layer of the uterus, otherwise you could lose the baby. And that's, of course, what would happen if there was no pregnancy and the woman entered flow phase in her menstrual cycle again. Remember our friend oxytocin from chapter 15, from our endocrine chapter. Oxytocin gets released from the posterior pituitary, and it acts on that muscular layer, myometrium of the uterus, to produce those strong contractions, which of course get just more intense and closer together. And typically, a woman would not think about perhaps going to the hospital until those contractions are about 10 minutes apart or so. Of course, that doesn't mean that the baby might not come more quickly than expected, but typically this course of labor is going to take a little bit of time. There are prostaglandins, which are localized hormones, which are going to aid the contractions as well. But oxytocin is the one to really remember. At this stage, if we turn our attention to the cervix needs to dilate, and I think we've talked about that before, guys. So we need to get about a 10 centimeter dilation. So here's this roll of masking tape here. That's approximately a 10 centimeter dilation of the cervix. We don't want the woman to push before the cervix dilates. Otherwise, we could have some damage if the baby's head is trying to squeeze its way through an opening that, I mean, it's already small as it is. We don't need it any smaller. So the doctor or nurse or whoever is helping deliver this baby will tell the mother not to push until we have the dilation that's safe for the baby's delivery. Some women, of course, there is a due date. Did you know only 5% of babies are actually born on the date that perhaps the doctor says that the baby will come? So only 5%. If it's your first baby, quite often it may be later than that due date. If the doctors are worried at all, because they are going to monitor the baby's health, the mother's health near the end of pregnancy, if they're worried about things like blood pressure or the baby being stressed at all, then they may induce the pregnancy at a specific time. And that induction, my wife was induced, so she gets a synthetic oxytocin to help speed things along. And in some cases, it can really very much speed things along. In her case, I think she only had 6 to 8 hours of labor. As soon as they put the drip on her, there was none of this 20 minutes between contractions and then less and less and less. It started pretty intense and pretty quickly. Okay. So you know how we love hormone flow charts. So this is the hormone flow chart that relates to oxytocin. There's our friend the hypothalamus. It uses nerves to communicate with the posterior pituitary. The posterior pituitary secretes oxytocin due to that nervous stimulation. The oxytocin works on the uterus to cause muscular contractions. Those contractions push the head of the baby against the cervix, which sends a positive feedback to the hypothalamus, continuing to strengthen its impulses, strengthening the oxytocin, and so on and so forth. So this is a case of positive feedback. Okay, so once the cervix is 10 centimeters dilated, the baby can now successfully pass through the birth canal with quite a bit of discomfort, as you know and can imagine for the mother. Membranes rupture due to the increase in pressure. So remember that the baby is floating in its amniotic sac filled with amniotic fluid. Well, the amniotic membrane will rupture either naturally or to speed delivery. Sometimes if labor is taking a long time, if this was the case of my sister, her water hadn't broken, she was in labor, so they took, it looks a little like a knitting needle with a hook on the end, and vaginally they insert that, and they find that amniotic sac, and they manually hook onto it and puncture it. And then the water breaks, and after the water has been released, labor usually picks up significantly. Okay, second stage of labor, we have the baby passing through the birth canal, passing through the vagina. Uterine contractions are very close together, very powerful, and the mom will definitely feel this urge to push. And so the doctors will encourage the pushing when a contraction is felt, so simultaneously. Okay, in your PowerPoint you have this slide of the baby coming out, hopefully head first. That's not always the case. The baby may not turn in the third trimester of pregnancy and kind of go legs or bum first, and that's called a breech birth, and that may actually need a cesarean section depending on how much stress the baby is experiencing. Perhaps the baby can be turned. That can often be encouraged before labor occurs. Now the placenta itself, after the baby is delivered, the placenta needs to separate and be delivered as well. That's kind of the third stage of labor. Bunch of baby pictures. All right, lactation. So of course, once the baby is born, the baby needs to be fed. So a very quick overview of that. Remember, we have our pituitary gland again, and this time in the anterior pituitary, we had the production of prolactin. Prolactin stimulates milk production in the breast tissue, the mammary glands of the mother. The baby will suckle at the breast of the mother, which provides positive feedback to the pituitary gland, and the pituitary gland secretes oxytocin, and oxytocin helps, again, remember it's a muscle contractor, so it's going to help to contract breast muscle to help squeeze the milk as the baby nurses. And so remember, so there's your two primary hormones for lactation. Prolactin to produce the milk, and oxytocin to release the milk. And there's other things that can increase the release of oxytocin. Simply a nursing mother, all she needs to do is hear a baby cry, and she may release milk. And so quite often a woman may use pads in her bra so that there's no embarrassing milk letdown when she doesn't want there to be. Okay, so we talked about those mammary glands. You don't have to memorize any of this specific information except for the fact that prolactin promotes the production of the milk in the breast. It first starts as a kind of thicker, fatty liquid called colostrum. So it's a very rich, small amount, but eventually, quickly it will become more of milk that we would think of when we think of milk. There are antibodies, so just to put a PSA out there for breastfeeding, and there's a whole organization that promotes breastfeeding. I think it's called the Lychee League, and they promote breastfeeding for quite some time, and the benefits of breastfeeding, one of the benefits is antibodies. So antibodies created by the immune system of the mother can pass over into the milk in the breast tissue, and then that of course can be passed to babies, because babies don't have a very fully functional or happening immune system for quite some time, so they get that little bit of extra protection. And it is got exactly the right balance of milk, sugars, proteins, and fats that baby needs. Okay, so again, we have in a flow chart form exactly what we talked about in terms of the nerve impulses going to that posterior pituitary. There's that oxytocin. The oxytocin allows the milk to be let down from the breast tissue. It enters the nipple. The baby sucks on the nipple, which causes positive feedback by nerves to the hypothalamus to continue that. Okay, so the last thing to talk about, guys, are just a few technologies that can be used in utero to help diagnose if there's any issues with this developing baby. So one technology is called amniocentesis. So this would be using a syringe and ultrasound to penetrate the abdomen, to enter that amniotic sac and withdraw fluid, because within that fluid are going to be baby cells. And so it would be a cellular analysis, especially to determine things like chromosome number, to perhaps rule out Down syndrome, which is a chromosome abnormality we'll be talking about a little bit later. And so doing this kind of procedure could be useful for that. Chorionic villi sampling, CVS. So this would be a vaginal, it's doing the same thing in terms of trying to, it's actually going to take a little bit of chorionic tissue. Remember those finger-like projections on the outside layer of a developing embryo? And because those are still baby cells, so they're still going to be able to give us genetic information about this developing baby. It can be done much earlier than amniocentesis, so that could be one reason to do this technique rather than amnio. And then of course you're probably all familiar with sonograms or using ultrasounds to see how that baby is growing and developing, and of course it's not obtrusive because we're simply using sound waves to see the growth of the baby and the development of the baby, the sex of the baby, so that's used most commonly at different times through the pregnancy. There you have it. So I wish you the best of luck in your studying and for a really great result on your test.